Did you know that some of the most daring acts of defiance against power happened in the quiet confines of medieval convents? Were you aware that even in the darkest corners of the Middle Ages, from roughly 500 CE to 1500 CE, women found ways to speak truth to power, often against mighty bishops? And even the Pope himself. This isn't just history, it's a saga of raw courage. Number 10. Hildegard of Bingen, the mystic who silenced an entire city. In the heart of the 12th century, a woman named Hildegard emerged from the Benedictine monastery of Disibodenberg, not as a quiet nun, but as a thundering voice. Born in 1098, she was known throughout Europe for her profound mystical visions, which she claimed came directly from God. But Hildegard was far from a passive recipient of divine messages. She actively used her spiritual authority to challenge the powerful men of her time, even when it put her entire community at risk. Her most famous clash came in 1178, when a young nobleman, Burkhard, was buried in the cemetery of her own convent, Rupertsberg. Burkhard, despite his noble birth, had been excommunicated from the church for refusing to pay his tithes, a severe punishment in medieval society that meant he was considered cut off from God's grace. The local clergy demanded that Hildegard have Burkhard's body exhumed and removed from sacred ground. They insisted that by allowing an excommunicated man to lie in consecrated soil, she was defiling the very sanctity of her convent and challenging the authority of the church. Hildegard refused. She stood firm, asserting that Burkhard had reconciled with the church on his deathbed, a claim she based on her own spiritual insights and possibly private conversations with the dying man. She argued that since he had received the last rites, he was no longer excommunicated in the eyes of God, regardless of the bishop's formal declaration. This was a direct challenge to the ecclesiastical hierarchy's power to determine who was worthy of sacred burial. The local clergy, particularly the provost and the bishop of Mainz, were furious. They saw her refusal as blatant insubordination. Punish Hildegard and her community. They placed the entire Rupertsberg convent under an interdict. This was a devastating blow. An interdict meant that all religious services within the convent ceased. No mass could be celebrated, no sacraments administered, and the nuns were forbidden from singing the divine office, their daily prayers and hymns. For a community of nuns, whose lives revolved around spiritual devotion and liturgical song, this was akin to a spiritual death sentence. Their very purpose was silenced. The pressure on Hildegard was immense. Her nuns were heartbroken, unable to fulfill their spiritual duties. Yet, Hildegard did not waver. Instead of capitulating, she responded with a lengthy letter to the enraged prelates. In this powerful document, meticulously preserved in collections of her correspondence, she explained her spiritual reasons for refusing to exhume the body. She wrote that to disturb the dead was an act against divine will, and that her visions confirmed Burkhard's reconciliation with God. She argued that to remove the body would be to deny the grace of God and to undermine the very principles of Christian compassion. She even included a theological argument, asserting that the sacredness of the burial ground was not merely ceremonial but deeply spiritual, and that once consecrated, it remained so. What truly set Hildegard apart was her strategic use of her visionary authority. She presented her refusal not as personal stubbornness, but as a divine command, placing her spiritual insights above the rigid rules imposed by the male hierarchy. She framed the interdict itself as an insult to God, effectively turning the tables on her accusers. For months the interdict remained in place. The convent of Rupertsberg was a silent, sorrowful place. But Hildegard continued to write, to plead, and to assert her spiritual judgment. Her reputation as a prophetess and a holy woman was so widespread and deeply respected that even the powerful Archbishop of Mainz, Christian I of Buck, began to feel the pressure. He was far away, involved in imperial politics, and likely found the ongoing dispute with an elderly, renowned visionary a political inconvenience. Finally, after several agonizing months, the interdict was lifted. The archbishop, probably weary of the controversy and perhaps recognizing the weight of Hildegard's spiritual influence, commanded the local clergy to end their punishment. The reasons for the lifting of the interdict are complex, but historians suggest it was a combination of Hildegard's unyielding stance, her compelling spiritual arguments, and the sheer force of her international reputation. Records from the Diocese of Mainz, detailing the administrative actions of the time, confirm the lifting of the interdict without the exhumation of Burchard's body. Hildegard, a woman of profound faith and unshakable will, had directly defied the authority of a bishop and an archbishop, protecting her convent's autonomy and her spiritual interpretation of justice. And she had won. Her nuns could sing again. Number 9. Clare of Assisi, the lady who held poverty above papal power. In the early 13th century, a woman named Clare was born into a wealthy noble family in Assisi, Italy, in 1194. She was destined for a life of comfort and a politically advantageous marriage. Clare chose a radically different path, one that would put her at odds with her family, the established norms of her time, and even the very head of the church, the Pope himself. Inspired by the fervent preaching and simple lifestyle of Francis of Assisi, Clare renounced her privileged life. In 1212, she secretly left her family home and, with Francis's guidance, dedicated herself to a life of absolute poverty and spiritual devotion. She founded a new order of contemplative nuns, who would come to be known as the Poor Clares. From the very beginning, Clare established a privilege of poverty for her community. This was not merely about living simply. It was a radical commitment to owning no property either individually or communally. The nuns would rely entirely on alms, the charitable donations of others. This was a direct departure from most existing monastic orders for women, which typically relied on dowries, endowments, and property ownership to sustain themselves. The church hierarchy, including the papacy, viewed communal property as essential for the stability and survival of monastic institutions, particularly for women, who were seen as needing more protection and provision. For over 40 years, Clare fought tirelessly to secure official papal approval for this privilege of poverty. Successive popes, including Gregory IX and Innocent IV, were deeply uneasy with Clare's radical vision. They genuinely feared that without property, the Poor Clares would be vulnerable, unable to sustain themselves, and become a burden on the church. They offered her alternative rules that permitted some communal property to ensure the long-term viability of her order. They believed they were acting in the best interests of the nuns. Records from the papal chancery from this period show numerous attempts to persuade Clare to accept a less stringent form of poverty, offering various concessions for communal ownership. But Clare was unyielding. She saw communal poverty not as a hardship, but as the very core of her spiritual calling, a direct imitation of Christ's own life and the example of Francis. She believed it was essential for the nuns to live in complete trust of God's providence, without the worldly entanglement of possessions. She argued her case with fierce conviction, appealing directly to the popes through letters and emissaries. She explained the theological underpinning of her commitment, emphasizing that poverty was a treasure and a form of spiritual freedom. Her persistence was legendary. She refused to accept any rule that compromised her radical commitment to absolute poverty. She became a thorn in the side of the papal curia, a seemingly frail woman standing firm against the immense power and authority of the Pope and his advisors. Conflict was not hostile in a personal sense, but it was a profound disagreement over the practical and theological implications of monastic life for women. As Clare lay on her deathbed in 1253 after decades of relentless petitioning, her battle was still not fully won. Pope Innocent IV, recognizing her unwavering dedication and the genuine spiritual fervor of her community, finally arrived at her convent. In a moment of profound historical significance, just 2 days before her death, he officially approved the form of life written by Clare herself, which included the absolute privilege of poverty. This approval, a papal bull titled Solit Annuaire, was a monumental victory. It was a direct validation of Clare's vision, overriding the prevailing ecclesiastical wisdom about monastic sustainability. This document, preserved in the Vatican archives and recabated in numerous monastic libraries, cemented the unique identity of the Poor Clares. Clare had successfully championed a radical economic model for women's religious life, a model that prioritized spiritual trust over worldly security. She had proven that a woman, even one confined to a cloister, could stand against the highest authority in the church and secure a rule that reflected her profound spiritual convictions. Her privilege of poverty became a defining characteristic of her order, demonstrating that a nun could indeed define her own spiritual path, even when it directly challenged established papal policies. Number 8. Roswitha of Gandersheim, the playwright who outsmarted pagan plays. In the 10th century, a remarkable woman named Roswitha lived within the walls of Gandersheim Abbey, a prominent Benedictine convent in Saxony, Germany. Born around 935 CE, she was not just a nun, she was a pioneering Latin dramatist and poet, considered by many to be the first known female playwright in Western literature. Her very existence as a prolific author challenged the prevailing view that women were primarily meant for domestic roles or quiet contemplation within convents. But it was her choice of subject matter and her deliberate literary strategy that truly pushed against the patriarchal norms of her time. In an era when classical Roman literature, particularly the comedies of the pagan playwright Terence, were widely studied and admired, Roswitha observed a problem. While Terence's plays were lauded for their wit and elegant Latin, many of them contained plots that, from a Christian perspective, were morally questionable. They often featured themes of lust, deceit, and immoral behavior, even if presented satirically. Christian scholars and educators grappled with how to appreciate the literary merit of these works without endorsing their problematic content. Roswitha, however, decided to take a bold and innovative approach. Instead of simply condemning or ignoring Terence, she decided to beat him at his own game. She wrote her own plays, using the very same sophisticated Latin prose and dramatic structures as Terence, but infusing them with Christian themes and promoting virtues rather than vices. Her works, including Dulcitius, Abraham, and Paphnutius, transformed ancient pagan tropes into tales of Christian martyrdom, conversion, and female chastity. She sought to prove that captivating drama did not need to rely on salacious themes, and that Christian stories could be just as engaging and intellectually stimulating. Her prefaces to her plays, meticulously copied and preserved in manuscript collections, like the one found in the Bavarian State Library, explicitly state her intention. She wrote that she wanted to celebrate the laudable chastity of Christian virgins using the form of comic plays. She aimed to counteract the disgraceful shamelessness of pagan wantonness that permeated the popular dramas of her time. This was not a subtle critique. It was a direct literary confrontation. Roswitha's plays presented strong female characters who, despite facing immense pressure, torture, and temptation, maintained their Christian faith and purity. In Dulcitius, 3 Christian virgins outsmart a pagan governor through their unwavering piety, causing him to become comically blackened with soot while attempting to defile them. In Paphnutius, a wise hermit converts a famous courtesan, Thais, demonstrating the power of spiritual redemption over worldly corruption. These plays were not just entertaining, they were didactic tools designed to educate and inspire audiences with Christian values, presented in a format that was already popular but morally ambiguous. Her work directly challenged the male-dominated literary and intellectual landscape of her time. Writing was largely the domain of educated men in monasteries and courts. For a nun to not only write, but to engage with and transform a major classical genre was a remarkable achievement. Her plays were circulated and read, a testament to their literary quality and the effectiveness of her approach. She demonstrated that women, even within the confines of a convent, possessed the intellectual capacity and creative genius to shape the cultural discourse and offer morally uplifting alternatives to existing popular. Roswitha's strategic reappropriation of classical drama, her deliberate intention to redeem the genre for Christian purposes, and her success in creating engaging and influential works represent a significant win. She didn't just challenge the content of male-authored popular literature, she demonstrated that a woman could master those same literary tools and use them to champion her own values and narratives, directly outmaneuvering the cultural influence of problematic pagan works and establishing a new precedent for Christian drama. Her plays are still studied today, a lasting testament to her intellectual prowess and artistic triumph. Number 7. Christina of Markiate, the hermit who escaped a forced marriage and defied authority. In the early 12th century, a young woman named Christina, born in Huntingdon, England around 1096, found herself in a desperate situation. Her parents, wealthy and influential, arranged a marriage for her against her will. Christina, however, had committed herself to a life of chastity and devotion to God. This was not a passive preference. She had taken a private vow to remain a virgin and serve God, a deeply personal spiritual commitment that clashed violently with her family's worldly ambitions. The man chosen for her, a nobleman named Bird, was powerful and persistent. Christina's parents, particularly her mother, were relentless in their efforts to force the marriage, employing emotional manipulation, physical confinement, and even magical charms, according to contemporary accounts from the life of Christina of Markiate, a hagiographical text written by a monk named Thomas of Canterbury. Christina, however, possessed an iron will. She resisted the marriage proposal for years, a truly extraordinary act of defiance in an age where women had little say in their matrimonial fates. She refused to eat. She feigned illness. She even tried to escape. Her parents, frustrated by her obstinacy, sought the intervention of the highest ecclesiastical authority in England, Ranulph Flambard, the Bishop of Durham. Bishop Flambard, a powerful and politically astute figure, was initially sympathetic to Christina's parents, viewing her resistance as disobedience. He tried to persuade Christina to accept the marriage, offering dispensations and arguments that would have satisfied most. But Christina would not be swayed. She eloquently articulated her commitment to God and her vow of virginity. In a daring move, she appealed directly to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Ralph de Sceurs, bypassing the local bishop. This was a risky maneuver as it challenged the authority of the local prelate and her family's influence. Records from the period indicate that her case became a matter of wider ecclesiastical discussion, attracting the attention of various church officials. When all pleas failed and her parents persisted, Christina took the drastic step of escaping from her family home. She fled into the wilderness, seeking refuge with various sympathetic religious figures and communities who understood her spiritual conviction. She lived as a hermit, often in incredibly harsh conditions, enduring hunger, cold, and constant fear of discovery. Her journey involved disguises, hiding in plain sight, and relying on the kindness of strangers. One instance describes her hiding in a tiny cell near St. Albans Abbey, receiving food through a narrow opening, effectively living a life of extreme seclusion to preserve her spiritual freedom. Her prolonged resistance and public defiance of her parents, as well as the attempts of powerful bishops to coerce her, eventually drew the attention of influential figures, including Thurston, the Archbishop of York. Over time, her story became widely known among religious circles. The sheer determination of her fight, her spiritual conviction, and her willingness to endure extreme hardship for her vow began to shift public and ecclesiastical opinion. Eventually, after years of hiding and a protracted legal and spiritual battle that played out across several dioceses, the Church formally recognized her vow of chastity. The arranged marriage was annulled, and Christina was finally free to pursue her chosen path. She became a reclusive hermit at Markyate, near St. Albans, and later founded a priory for women, where she became its first prioress. Her authority within the priory was absolute, a direct result of her proven spiritual fortitude and her triumph over immense patriarchal pressure. Christina's victory was not just personal. It was a public declaration that a woman's spiritual vocation, even if privately made, could supersede the demands of family and the authority of powerful male figures, including bishops, to arrange her life. She had effectively asserted her autonomy over her own body and spiritual destiny, a profound challenge to the patriarchal structures that sought to control women through marriage and obedience. Her story, preserved in her biography, serves as a powerful testament to a woman who chose her own path, fought relentlessly for it, and ultimately won her freedom against staggering odds. Number 6. Mechthild of Magdeburg, the mystic poet who dared to criticize the clergy. Born around 1207, Mechthild of Magdeburg was a German beguine, a type of lay religious woman who lived a communal pious life without taking formal monastic vows, allowing for a degree of independence not always available to cloistered nuns. Mechthild's life was defined by intense, mystical experiences, which she began to record in her seminal work, The Flowing Light of the Godhead. This book was not just a personal spiritual diary. It was a fiery, poetic, and often critical commentary on the religious and social world around her. A commentary that frequently challenged the male-dominated church hierarchy. Mechthild's writings are filled with vivid descriptions of her visions, her fervent love for God, and her profound spiritual insights. She also used her prophetic voice to denounce what she saw as corruption and hypocrisy within the clergy. She openly criticized priests, monks, and even bishops for their worldly ambitions, their lack of spiritual fervor, and their failure to live up to their sacred calling. She wrote passages where she directly admonished the lukewarm clergy, accusing them of loving money more than God and of neglecting their pastoral duties. One passage, found in surviving manuscripts of The Flowing Light, speaks of priests who are drunk on earthly wine rather than the Spirit, a scathing critique. In the 13th century, to openly criticize the clergy, especially by a woman and a lay religious figure, was incredibly dangerous. Church held immense power, and dissent could lead to accusations of heresy which carried severe penalties, including imprisonment or even execution. The idea that a woman, particularly one without formal theological training or official clerical status, would have the spiritual authority to call out male religious leaders was a direct challenge to the established order. Women were generally expected to be submissive and quiet, not public critics of powerful institutions. Mechthild, however, believed her criticisms were divinely inspired. She saw herself as a messenger, compelled by God to speak uncomfortable truths. She used allegorical language, vibrant metaphors, and direct address to convey her messages, often portraying God as a divine lover, yearning for sincere devotion in contrast to the worldly failings of many churchmen. Her critiques were not just abstract. They were pointed observations on the moral failings she witnessed in her contemporary church. Her writings circulated widely, despite the risks. She faced significant opposition and even persecution because of her outspokenness. She recounts in her book instances of suspicion and hostility from those who felt threatened by her words. She mentions being slandered and suffering great tribulation due to her visions and her outspoken nature. Despite this, she continued to write and refine her work for decades, a testament to her courage and conviction. Later in her life, around 1270, due to ongoing persecution and the fragility of her health, Mechthild left the Bingen community in Magdeburg and sought refuge in the Cistercian convent of Helfta. This was a strategic move, as Helfta was a renowned intellectual and spiritual center for women, known for its protective environment and the support it offered to mystics like Mechthild. At Helfta, her writings were meticulously preserved, copied, and even translated into Latin by the convent's chaplain, Henry of Halle. This act of preservation and translation was crucial, ensuring her message reached a wider audience and endured for centuries. The very survival and circulation of the flowing light of the Godhead, despite its controversial content, demonstrates Mechthild's success. She was not silenced. Her powerful female voice, unafraid to challenge the spiritual integrity of the male hierarchy, reached audiences across Europe. Her work became an influential text of German mysticism. She won by persisting, by continuing to speak truth to power through her writing, and by having her critiques preserved and disseminated by her own religious community, effectively bypassing and outliving the attempts to silence her. She proved that a woman's spiritual authority could indeed call out the powerful, and that her words could endure even in the face of persecution. Number 5. Elizabeth of Schonau, the visionary who exposed clerical neglect. In the mid-12th century, Elizabeth of Schonau, a Benedictine nun born around 1129, became widely known for her intense and frequent mystical visions. Living in the monastery of Schonau, in what is now Germany, Elizabeth was not just a recipient of divine messages. She saw it as her duty to convey these messages, even when they were uncomfortable truths directed at the powerful male clergy. Her visions often focused on the sufferings of souls in purgatory and the need for their redemption, but they also extended to severe critiques of the moral state of the Church. One of Elizabeth's most notable challenges to patriarchal authority came through her direct communication of visions that specifically accused priests of neglecting their duties and living sinful lives. She claimed that these failures led to the suffering of souls and undermined the spiritual well-being of the Christian community. For example, some of her visions recorded by her brother Egbert, who also served as her confessor and scribe, described how the neglectful prayers of priests prolonged the torment of souls in the afterlife. She also had visions that exposed specific instances of clerical corruption, including priests illicitly taking money or living with women outside of marriage. To publicly articulate such criticisms, particularly from a woman cloistered in a convent, was audacious. It was a direct affront to the dignity and authority of the male priesthood, who were considered God's anointed representatives on earth. The prevailing view was that women were spiritually weaker and less capable of theological insight than men, certainly not qualified to pass judgment on their spiritual superiors. Yet, Elizabeth delivered her critiques with unwavering conviction, presenting them not as her own opinions, but as divine revelations. Her brother Egbert played a crucial role in validating and disseminating her visions. He meticulously recorded them, providing an official imprimatur to her messages. This collaboration was key to her success. While he served as her scribe and protector, he also recognized the authenticity of her spiritual experiences and the importance of her message. His support helped her navigate the treacherous waters of ecclesiastical scrutiny. Despite the inherent challenges, Elizabeth's visions gained significant traction. Her messages were widely circulated, and her spiritual authority grew. Rather than being suppressed as a troublesome woman, she was consulted by powerful figures, including archbishops and abbots, who sought her spiritual guidance. This indicates that her critiques, though challenging, were often taken seriously, at least in part because of the widespread belief in the authenticity of mystical experiences during that era. The very fact that her detailed visions replete with pointed observations about clerical failings, were preserved and copied, suggests a degree of acceptance and influence. One specific instance of her impact involved her visions concerning the fate of souls who had died without proper rites or who had committed secret sins. She often pressed for greater diligence from priests in administering sacraments and offering prayers for the deceased. These pressures, stemming from her visions, contributed to ongoing discussions within the Church about pastoral responsibilities and clerical morality. Historical records from the period, particularly letters exchanged between monasteries and dioceses, show that her visions were a topic of discussion among learned men and were not simply dismissed. Elizabeth's success lay in her ability to leverage her mystical experiences to carve out a unique space of authority. She was a woman who dared to speak uncomfortable truths to powerful male figures, not as a rebel without divine sanction, but as a direct instrument of God's will. She won by having her prophetic voice heard, by compelling powerful male clergy to consider her criticisms, and by seeing her critiques become part of the broader conversation about church reform, all while remaining within the expected confines of monastic life. Her detailed accounts, preserved and studied, demonstrate that her challenging messages endured, shaping spiritual discourse in her time and beyond. Number 4. Catherine of Siena, the laywoman who commanded popes. Catherine of Siena, born in 1347, was not a cloistered nun in the traditional sense, but a Dominican tertiary, a laywoman affiliated with a religious order. This meant she lived in the world, albeit under religious vows, giving her a unique platform to engage with society and challenge authority in ways that a cloistered nun could not. Her life was a whirlwind of activism, diplomacy, and spiritual instruction, all directed towards the powerful male figures of the Church, including the popes themselves. Her most audacious challenge was her relentless campaign to persuade Pope Gregory XI to leave Avignon, France, and return the papacy to Rome. For nearly 70 years, the popes had resided in Avignon, a period known as the Avignon Papacy. This exile was seen by many, including Catherine, as a grave scandal, undermining the spiritual authority of the Pope and leading to corruption and political entanglement. Bringing the Pope back to Rome was a monumental task, involving intricate diplomacy, immense political pressure, and challenging centuries of established practice. Catherine began sending letters, direct and forceful, to Pope Gregory XI. These letters, meticulously preserved in collections of her correspondence, are astonishing for their frankness. She addressed the Pope not as a submissive petitioner, but as a spiritual mother speaking to her son, or even as a divine messenger. She urged him to act with courage, to reform the Church, and above all, to return to Rome. She wrote to him, for instance, saying he should be a manly man and not a timid child, urging him to leave the rose garden of Avignon and return to the cross of Rome. This was an unprecedented level of direct admonition from a laywoman to the supreme head of the Church. Her influence grew. She traveled extensively, engaging in political negotiations, mediating conflicts, and advising rulers. Despite lacking any formal position of power, her reputation for holiness, her powerful personality, and her perceived divine inspiration gave her a unique leverage. She was not just writing letters, she was actively mobilizing support for her cause, persuading cardinals and other influential figures. In 1376, Catherine traveled to Avignon herself. This was an extraordinary journey for a woman of her time, and it was a direct confrontation with the heart of papal power. She spent months there, engaging in intense discussions with Pope Gregory XI and his curia. She delivered her messages in person, reiterating her divine mandate for his return to Rome. Her presence and her compelling arguments were undeniable. More, she also challenged the male-dominated intellectual and theological world. She dictated complex theological treatises, such as the Dialogue, which explored deep spiritual truths, despite having no formal education. She was known to challenge learned theologians in debate, demonstrating profound spiritual insight and intellectual clarity. Contemporary accounts, including letters from her confessors and spiritual disciples, attest to her ability to hold her own in discussions with the most educated men of her era. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI finally made the momentous decision to return to Rome. While many factors influenced his decision, including political pressure from Rome itself, Catherine of Siena's tireless advocacy, her powerful letters, and her personal presence in Avignon are widely acknowledged by historians as having played a significant, if not decisive, role. Chroniclers of the time, such as Raymond of Capua, her confessor, vividly describe her personal persuasion of the Pope as a key factor. Catherine of Siena's triumph was immense. A laywoman without an official position had successfully pressured the Pope to make a decision that altered the course of church history. She had wielded spiritual and moral authority over the most powerful man in the Western world, compelling him to act against established tradition. Her achievement demonstrated that a woman's voice, fueled by spiritual conviction, could indeed move mountains, challenging the very structure of papal authority and successfully influencing the fate of the Church. She proved that even from outside the formal male hierarchy, a woman could command the powerful and win. Number 3. Bridget of Sweden, the royal widow who founded an order and challenged papal decisions. Bridget of Sweden, born around 1303, was a formidable figure, a royal widow and mother of 8, who became a mystic, a prophetess, and eventually a saint. After the death of her husband, she adopted a life of intense piety, experiencing vivid visions that she believed were direct communications from Christ and the Virgin Mary. These visions formed the basis of her influential revelations, which she dictated to her confessors. But Bridget was far from passive. She used her perceived divine mandate to actively intervene in the political and ecclesiastical affairs of her time, often challenging the highest authorities in the Church. Her most significant challenge to patriarchal power came through her determined efforts to found a new religious order, the Order of the Most Holy Savior, known as the Brigittines. Made this order unique and challenging to established norms was its structure. It was a double monastery, housing both nuns and monks, but crucially, the abbess held ultimate authority over both communities. The abbess, a woman, was to be the spiritual head of the entire institution, a direct subversion of the typical patriarchal hierarchy where male abbots always held precedence. This was a radical departure from the prevailing understanding of women's roles in monastic governance. Establishing a new order required papal approval, and Bridget tirelessly lobbied successive popes, first in Rome and later in Avignon, to secure this. She presented her visions as divine instructions for the order's unique structure, insisting that the abbess's authority was God-given. This was a direct appeal over and above the established rules and traditions of monastic governance. Popes naturally were hesitant to approve such a departure from norms, especially concerning female leadership over men. Records from the papal curia from the mid-14th century show prolonged negotiations and revisions of the Brigittine rule, indicating the papal discomfort with the abbess's extensive authority. Beyond founding her order, Bridget was also an outspoken critic of the moral failings of the clergy and the political situation of her time. She denounced corruption, simony, and the luxurious lives of many churchmen, delivering scathing critiques through her revelations. She directly addressed kings, emperors, and popes, often with sharp admonitions, urging them to reform their lives and govern justly. For example, she famously called Pope Clement VI a destroyer of souls in one of her visions, a shockingly direct insult to the pontiff. She also vehemently urged Pope Gregory XI to return to Rome from Avignon, mirroring Catherine of Siena's campaign, which was another direct challenge to papal policy. Her persistence and the compelling nature of her visions eventually paid off. Despite the revolutionary nature of her order's structure, particularly the female leadership, Pope Urban V gave preliminary approval to the Brigittine rule in 1370. Later, Pope Urban VI formally approved the definitive rule, including the clause granting the abbess spiritual authority over the monks after Brigit's death. This papal approval was a testament to Brigit's unwavering determination and the power of her perceived divine mandate. The fact that the Vatican archives contain the papal bull of approval, confirming the unique governance structure, solidifies her victory. Brigid of Sweden's triumph was multifaceted. She successfully founded an innovative religious order that granted unprecedented authority to women, directly challenging the patriarchal model of monastic governance. She commanded respect and attention from the highest secular and spiritual rulers of her time, even daring to scold popes and kings for their moral failings. By leveraging her visions and her remarkable tenacity, she shaped the institutional landscape of the Church, leaving a lasting legacy that empowered women within her order. She proved that a woman, guided by her spiritual conviction, could establish a new structure of religious life that actively elevated female authority, winning against deeply ingrained patriarchal expectations. Number 2. Aduich, the poet-mystic, who reimagined divine love and challenged orthodoxies. In the 13th century, a woman known only as Hadewich lived in the Duchy of Brabant in what is now Belgium. She was a Beglein like Mechthild of Magdeburg, meaning she was a lay religious woman who lived a devout life in community, but without formal monastic vows, which often allowed her a certain intellectual and spiritual freedom. Hadewich was a prolific writer, creating a body of work including letters, poems, and prose visions, which are considered among the masterpieces of Dutch mystical literature. Her profound and intensely personal mystical experiences, particularly her understanding of divine love, often pushed against the boundaries of conventional theological expression and societal expectations for women. Hadewich's central challenge to the patriarchal intellectual and spiritual climate was her audacious reimagining of the relationship between the human soul and God. While traditional theology often emphasized God's transcendence and human sinfulness, Hadewich articulated a radical concept of min, or divine love, as an all-consuming dree and often agonizing force that demanded complete immersion. Her poems, particularly her strophic poems and songs, depict this love in terms of passionate reciprocal desire, using rich, sometimes even erotic imagery that was highly unconventional for a woman of her time writing about God. For a woman to delve into such complex theological and mystical concepts and to express them in a profoundly personal and emotionally charged manner was a subtle but powerful act of defiance. Theology was overwhelmingly a male domain, studied and debated in universities and monasteries by learned men. Women were largely excluded from such intellectual pursuits, and their spiritual experiences were often viewed with suspicion or reduced to simple piety. Hadewich, however, engaged with the deepest mysteries of faith, articulating her own unique and sophisticated understanding of divine love. Her detailed prose visions, for instance, portray her direct interactions with Christ, conversations that possess an intellectual rigor combined with spiritual depth. Furthermore, Hadewich's interpretation of min was not passive. It demanded an active, often painful, striving for union with God, pushing individuals to their limits. This dynamic relationship, in her view, was open to all, regardless of gender or formal clerical status. She encouraged her followers, often other women, to pursue this intense spiritual journey, empowering them to seek direct experience of the divine, rather than relying solely on male intermediaries or prescribed theological doctrines. Her letters, which survive in various manuscripts, are filled with spiritual guidance to her daughters or fellow Beguines, urging them to deepen their love and knowledge of God through personal effort and experience. The very act of writing such extensive and complex literary works in her vernacular language, rather than Latin, also contributed to her challenge. While Latin was the language of scholarship and the Church, Hildegard chose to express her deepest insights in a language accessible to a broader audience, including women. This choice allowed her profound mystical theology to reach and influence individuals beyond the confines of academic and clerical institutions. Hildegard's victory was not a direct confrontation with a specific person or institution, but a triumph of intellectual and spiritual autonomy. She carved out a unique space for a woman's voice in the highly restricted field of mystical theology and religious literature. Her writings survived and were meticulously copied, demonstrating their profound impact and enduring value. Generations of mystics and scholars have studied her work, a testament to her intellectual depth and originality. She was never condemned for heresy despite the boldness of her expressions, which speaks to the perceived authenticity and spiritual power of her writings. Through her compelling poetry and prose, Hildegard proved that a woman could not only experience the divine on her own terms, but could also articulate a sophisticated and challenging theology of love that enriched the spiritual landscape of her era. She succeeded in asserting her own intellectual and spiritual authority, shaping the understanding of divine love for centuries and inspiring countless readers to seek a deeper, more passionate connection with God, all through the power of her written word. Number 1. Julian of Norwich, the anchoress who redefined God as mother and challenged theological gloom. Born around 1342, Julian of Norwich lived through some of the most tumultuous periods of medieval history, including the Black Death, which decimated populations across Europe. She was an anchoress, a type of religious recluse who lived in a small cell attached to a church, dedicating her life to prayer and contemplation. This secluded existence might seem far from any form of challenge, but Julian's internal spiritual journey and the theological insights she articulated in her book, Revelations of Divine Love, were profoundly radical for her time, and subtly but powerfully challenged the prevailing patriarchal theological frameworks. Julian's most striking and enduring challenge was her revolutionary concept of God as mother. In a patriarchal society where God was almost exclusively depicted in masculine terms, Father, Lord, King, Son, Julian dared to present God with feminine attributes and even as a maternal figure. She wrote, in a passage that has astonished theologians for centuries, "As truly as God is our Father, so truly is God our Mother." She further elaborated on this, describing Jesus as our Mother of Mercy, and comparing the love of Christ to a mother's care for her child. Nourishing us with spiritual sustenance, enduring labor for us, and never abandoning us, this was not merely poetic license. Julian's assertion of God's motherhood was a deeply felt theological conviction, derived from her visions. It directly countered the predominantly male-centric language and imagery of the Church. It offered a compassionate, nurturing, and intimately relational understanding of the divine, a stark contrast to the often stern, judgmental, and distant God preached by many male theologians and clergy. Her words, preserved in 2 versions of her Revelations, a shorter text and a much longer, more developed one, both found in manuscripts like the one held at the British Library, speak with profound conviction. Furthermore, Julian's theology was characterized by an overwhelming optimism about God's love and the ultimate salvation of all humanity, despite the widespread emphasis on sin, damnation, and the wrath of God in medieval preaching. In an era marked by plagues, war, and widespread suffering, where fear of hell was a powerful tool of clerical control, Julian's persistent affirmation that all shall be well and all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well was a defiant message of hope. She wrestled with the problem of sin and evil, but always returned to the certainty of God's merciful love and a belief in ultimate redemption. This hopeful outlook, coming from a woman living in deep contemplation, provided a powerful counter-narrative to the prevailing theological gloom, which often served to reinforce clerical authority through fear. Living as an anchoress gave Julian a unique position. While physically confined, she was also spiritually autonomous. She was not under the direct daily supervision of an abbot or bishop in the same way a communal nun might be. People from all walks of life, including learned clergy, came to her cell for spiritual counsel. This allowed her profound insights to be heard and respected, even as she articulated ideas that subtly challenged established norms. Julian's victory lies in the enduring power and influence of her written work. Her revelations of divine love survived the centuries, copied and revered for their spiritual depth. Unlike many mystics whose works were censored or forgotten, Julian's text remained a source of profound theological reflection. She successfully introduced and sustained a radically inclusive and compassionate understanding of God's nature, particularly emphasizing divine motherhood within the Christian tradition. She proved that a woman, living in seclusion and relying solely on her spiritual experience, could generate theological ideas that were both profoundly original and deeply comforting, offering a counterbalance to the often rigid and fear-inducing patriarchal interpretations. Her words continue to resonate today, a testament to her quiet but immensely powerful challenge to the theological status quo.